On today's show, we'll be joined by Paulo Alves, host of the Launchpad podcast, to take a look at a thought experiment regarding the Houston Rockets rotations for this upcoming season and the gigantic, monumental task Stephen Silas will be faced with as far as just how to divvy up the minutes amongst so many guys on this Rockets squad. We'll take a look at that and more coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays, host of the State of the Rockets podcast, as well as Rockets Watch. You can follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin, and the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets. We are free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. Joining us now is host of the Launchpad podcast, Paulo Alves. You can follow on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. And today we're talking Houston Rockets rotations, and we're going to get into all sorts of hypotheticals, thought experiments, and all that fun stuff with the rotations today, as inspired by your latest piece for your new newsletter, Paulo, which is going to be, I'll give you a chance to plug the newsletter a little bit later on. But let's start with some of the objectives that you kind of had when you were piecing together this article and when you were exploring what the Rockets rotations could potentially look like this season. What were some of the things at the forefront of your mind that you were focused on trying to achieve with this thought experiment?
Right. I think one of the most important things is we are rebuilding, and the most important thing isn't winning. However, you still want to play basketball to a decent enough level to where the guys are evolving, right? And so an important principle right away is let's try to not play more than one non-shooter on the floor. And I define a non-shooter a little bit differently. Instead of it being a guy that shoots 33% plus from three, I define the non-shooter as someone who I would not be comfortable taking a shot, which means, for example, Jae'Sean is a guy that's probably not going to be a great shooter coming in. However, shooting is a key factor to his development, so I'm okay with him taking as many wide open threes or catch and shoot threes as the offense can give him, because that's going to contribute towards his development, if that makes sense. Opposite to that is a guy like Jae'Sean, who is young but not that young anymore, right? And it's less important for him to get those reps, and so I counted Jae'Sean as a non-shooter, at least to start the season. And I counted guys like Jae'Sean or KJ Martin, KJ Martin to a lesser extent, as shooters, because those are guys that I want shooting those shots, right?
Okay, and I can buy into that because I like so I do think it's very interesting, right? Because, and this kind of harkens back to last season, right? Is we dumped a lot of the Rockets' problems on what was effectively deemed the double big lineup, when realistically that wasn't the problem. And I think over time, fans started becoming more acclimated to the idea of calling it the double non-shooter lineup was much more of the issue. Playing two guys simultaneously that don't necessarily have the shooting gravity from beyond the arc, which again kind of clogs things up offensively, yada, 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 all the issues that we saw, that were prevalent with last year's Rockets team. Did you kind of take some of that into account as well, or are you pretty much just focused on trying to maximize guys as far as just their potential as far as shooters go in the rotation?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, as I said, it comes down to if I want him shooting the shot, even if you're a non-shooter. For example, Garuba, spoiler alert, doesn't make it into the rotation, but if he had made it into the rotation, I would be okay with him being one of the shooters that actually can shoot, because I think it's important to him to develop that jump shot, right? And so I think as long as each possession going into it, if I finish with a Garuba shot that's a three, I'm comfortable with that, even if it misses. And it takes a little bit away from the functionality of the offense, right? You're going to lose, if Garuba can't shoot at all, you're going to lose a lot of games by a lot of points. But to me, that's the price of the reps he's getting on an NBA game to shoot those shots, right? To me, that's a fine price to pay. at the same time, if Jae'Sean Tate's shooting 10 threes a game and he's making 2 of them and the offense just doesn't make any sense, and you're losing the game because you're feeding Jae'Sean Tate a lot of catch and shoot looks that he's not making, then to me that becomes more of a problem because he's not one of those long-term pieces. And so you kind of don't want to be wasting all of these reps. You're generating open shots, correct, good for the guards, but the possession's not finishing positively. And to some extent, you do need some reward to these players making the correct decisions, right? More than the coach saying, oh, good pass, Jalen. Jalen wants to see the shot go in, right?
Okay, well, first off, 2 red flags already early in the podcast. The fact that you didn't include Garuba in the rotation, especially after his stellar Eurobasket play. So that's already red flag number 1. And then 2, the fact that you're saying Jae'Sean Tate's not a part of the Rockets' future, that's red flag number 2. So, I mean, just you got one more strike before I kick you off the podcast, Paulo. It's been too long, but I mean, you might not last another segment in this episode. No, so who were the shooters that you deemed the non-shooters then in this thought experiment?
I think the 2 non-shooters that I consider non-shooters were Alperen Sengun and Jae'Sean Tate. So I tried to have as little overlap as possible between Sengun and Tate. And that doesn't make too much sense when you consider that Jae'Sean Tate's one of the best cutters on the team and Sengun's really good at hitting cutters. That makes sense. But most of the time, if the offense is not running through Sengun and you're running, I don't know, a KPJ Sengun pick and roll, right? And the shot that Jae'Sean's defender helps, and the shots that's clearly available is going to be a lot of the time like it was last season, the Jae'Sean Tate wide open 3. And to me, that's not a productive shot, both towards functionality, which is one of the big question marks, and the other is just getting reps to guys that need them or to guys that are projected to be here for the next 5 years, for example. Jae'Sean has a 3-year contract. I love Jae'Sean, but to me, he's not as important as a guy like Tari Eason or as a guy like, say, a Jalen Green or a guy like Kevin Porter Jr. or a guy like Jabari Smith, right? In that regard, I kind of try to balance those things out. And when we get to it, we'll see that I don't think Jae'Sean Tate overlaps with Alperen Sengun almost anything. Right, and that was one of my main goals, and we'll get to more of them. But this really gets more difficult as we go along, and that made me have a renewed respect for the head coach position and him having to make these rotations, having taken into account so many factors. It's easy, and it was last season easy for people to just get on Twitter and be like, "Hey, like I can't believe Jalen Green's not playing as many minutes," or "I can't believe KPJ and Jalen Green are not getting staggered," right? And that was a big theme of what people blamed on Silas. That's his job, correct? But it's not as easy as you might think. For example, one of the things that I had to worry about is you can't be making substitutions every 2 minutes. I tried to limit it to a maximum of 2 sub breaks a quarter, right? Just dead balls or even call a timeout to get your subs in. It's really hard to make that work. And another thing that's really important is you don't want to bring on a guy, play him 2 minutes, and then bring him off again. And you want to do all of these things while trying to stagger someone or trying to keep 4 shooters on the floor at all times. It's a lot trickier than it looks. And I have multiple people, when I dropped the newsletter, I had multiple people reach out to me, and I was like, this is a lot harder than it seems. I challenge you to go to the website I used to do this, which I don't have at hand, but I'll get in a second, and actually try it for yourself, because it's a lot harder than it seems.
The website, by the way, is thehoopsgeek.com, and I will include a link to the rotation builder in the description of this episode, so you can go, try your hand at building a Rockets rotation as well. Because while I think this is a fun thought experiment, there's parts of it that I wholeheartedly disagree with, just from a realistic perspective, in the fact that you have Tari Eason starting, and that as whether or not that's optimal, the best for development, what we want to see, whatever, it's not going to happen. So it's kind of, it kind of throws a cog into things just from that perspective, where it's how realistic is the rest of the rotation? But the actual experiment of testing and plugging in different names and trying to see how you can line up certain guys and different substitution patterns, all that, I still think has a ton of merit here. And I do think, as far as just Alperen Sengun and Jae'Sean Tate, to your point about not kind of overlapping their minutes, I do feel that that's probably the direction that the team actually does ultimately go this season. And that's why I've leaned much more in the camp of I think Eric Gordon is going to start and be the starter, the fifth starter that we're kind of like TBD, like what's going to happen with the starting lineup. I think he's going to be the fifth starter. And I think Jae'Sean Tate's going to be the guy that kind of anchors that bench unit a little bit more. And I think we're going to see Stephen Silas kind of place a premium on the shooting that then surrounds the guys like Alp and like Jae'Sean in the lineup. That way they don't ever have more than one non-shooter on the floor at a time consecutively.
Yeah, and it's really tough to make that work because Jae'Sean is very much going to be an important part of the rotation, like it or not, right? And Sengun is going to be the same thing. And if Sengun's playing 30 minutes a game, then there's only 18 minutes left for Jae'Sean to play, and he's certainly going to play more than 18 minutes a game. And that's another of the things that makes it complicated, because you're going to need to overlap them at some point, unless you're taking minutes away from one or the other.
Yeah, and that's where so we'll get into some of the, how you stagger some of these lineups and what players we can expect to potentially either be staggered or be paired with one another, all of that. We're going to get there in just a moment after a quick message from our friends over at Rocket Money. Do you know how much subscriptions really cost? Most Americans think they spend around, $80 or so a month on subscription services when the actual total is closer to $200 or more. That's right. You could be wasting hundreds of dollars each and every month on subscriptions that you don't even know about sometimes. Rocket Money is the app that I love using that takes care of that problem for me. It's formerly known as Truebill. The app shows you all your subscriptions in one place and cancels what you don't want or need anymore. Rocket Money can even find subscriptions that you didn't know that you were paying for. You may even find out you've been double charged for certain subscriptions. To cancel a subscription, all you have to do is press cancel. You click the button and Rocket Money takes care of the rest. You can cancel unnecessary subscriptions with Rocket Money starting today. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Seriously, it could save you hundreds of dollars per year. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Continuing our little thought experiment about the Rockets rotations and some of the objectives to try and achieve this season. And one of the next things that I want to actually kind of shift to and focus here, Paulo, is looking at the way that you set up these rotations. One thing that I noticed is you didn't stagger Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr. What was your logic behind not wanting to stagger those two?
Yeah, it's mostly that I think we need to figure out what Alperen Sengun is as soon as possible, especially if next season we're looking at a potential of drafting Wembanyama or Aware or even Derek Lively, right? He is someone who's a very unique archetype of center, and the Rockets need to give him as many reps on the ball as possible because, in my opinion, he's someone who doesn't have a role player mode. I think he's either going to be a star or a six man, and I don't think there's much in between because if you're just going to be a role player, you'd probably want to have someone who's a better defender and better at playing off the ball. And so I wanted to showcase Alperen Sengun by himself as much as possible while still giving him some minutes with the main guys, those being Jabari, KPJ, and Jalen Green. And because of that, I gave Sengun his little, whenever KPJ and Jalen are resting, Sengun's always on the floor because I wanted one of the three always on the floor. And it would probably be possible to stagger all three of them and have, lineups with KPJ and Sengun but not Jalen, or lineups with Sengun and Jalen and not KPJ. But what makes that tough is what I said before in the previous segment, that you can only, I limited myself to 2 sub breaks a quarter. And so it's really tough to make that many substitutions to guys that are getting a big chunk of the minutes because you'll eventually be trying to patch too many holes you would set your KPJ, Jalen, and Sengun minutes first, and then you find yourself patching too many holes later on with the role players, and you'd find yourself either violating the one non-floor spacer at a time rule, or because Sengun is a non-floor spacer, or just violating the 2 sub breaks a quarter rule. It was mostly because of that, and then that makes it so it's a question between probably either KPJ or Sengun playing with Jalen, which one of them is going to be the one that gets staggered. And I ended up choosing Sengun because I think KPJ's is that it's a really important season for him, but it's more about getting others involved. Whereas for Alperen Sengun, it's also a lot about how well can you score, how much of an offensive hub can you be, and that's why I kind of gave him his little, units rather than going for someone like KPJ to get his own units.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at the way that minutes are going to be chopped up amongst these players, one thing that does stand out to me is you had Alperen Sengun actually closing out the game as far as just, his final little minutes burst. I think that it's much more likely that we'll see as the season progresses. I think it's going to be very likely at times that we don't see Alp on the floor in the closing moments of games. And I think it's very likely we're going to see some combination of, Jabari at the 5, maybe possibly Garuba situationally for defense, things like that. But I really genuinely think Jabari at the 5 is going to be a go-to closing lineup for the Rockets. Now, the pieces in and around that lineup, right? Maybe it's Jabari at the 5, Jalen and KPJ, Eric Gordon, and then take your pick, right, of Jae'Sean Tate or Tari Eason or a KJ Martin or maybe even a Garrison Matthews if we really need the shooting offensively, whatever. I think that's going to be a more of a go-to closing lineup. And then looking at the way that Alp's substitution patterns and the way that Christian Wood and Alp's substitution patterns worked last season, I think it's going to be very clear that Alp is basically going to get one rest each half. I think is what's going to happen, and then there might be situations where he doesn't close out the final minute or 2 or 3 minutes of a game, especially for defensive purposes if you want to be more versatile on the floor. So I do kind of envision him getting a significant rest somewhere around like the 3 to 4 minute mark left of the first quarter, and then checking back in with anywhere from 7 to 8 minutes left in the second quarter, that big gap basically at the end of the first, beginning of the second. And then that's the gap to me where you're going to get some Jabari at the 5, maybe some Usman Garuba minutes, maybe some uber small ball minutes, mixed into the rotation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when you want to stagger these guys, usually in an NBA rotation, and we saw it for a long time with James Harden, usually the main guys, they rest to close the quarter and they come back some minutes into the quarter afterwards, which is what makes it so tough to stagger them, because you only have 2 sub breaks a quarter, right? Like I said before. And if you want to stagger them, then you need to pull one of the 3 important guys, or the 4 most important guys, one of Jabari, Jalen, KPJ, or Sengun. You've got to pull them really early into the first quarter and really early into the third quarter. And the reason for that is because they're going to need to be there to start, and they're going to need to finish the half, they're going to need to finish the game in the second half. And so you're forced into, if you want to stagger them enough, you're forced into pulling them really early. I have Sengun coming off at the 5 minute mark in the first quarter, and then I have him taking a little break, and I have him playing from the 9th minute of the first quarter all the way until the 5th minute of the second quarter. And then I have at this point Tari Eason, but it could be Jabari Smith, it could be Usman Garuba if you want, closing out the second quarter. Then I have Sengun coming back to start the third. It's really tough. The tough thing with staggering is very much that. And if we're going to give Sengun the minutes like you said, then we're going to need to make either KPJ or Jalen come off really early into the first quarter. And I decided to make Sengun that person because it was rumored last season that he had some stamina issues, right? And so he's never playing more than 5 minutes at a time without a break. That be a break in the first quarter at the 5 minute mark to check back in the 9th minute mark, or that be a break of he checks back at minute 9 and then there's the break between the quarters, right? So I prioritize giving him those breaks because of what was said before of his stamina maybe not being the best.
Yeah, and I think that if you watched, at all throughout, Eurobasket and saw his play with the Turkish national team, I mean, he had stretches where he played an entire half against Nikola Jokic and Serbia, where he played 20 straight minutes, and he did look gassed by the end of it, but he was still effective, and he was a big part of the Turkish team comeback against Serbia in that game, ultimately, unfortunately, losing. But then, he's had stretches where he can play, a solid 10 plus, 12 plus minutes and not, be hands on his knees, completely winded, just completely out of gas. So I do think that the stamina concerns are hopefully now, knock on wood, a thing of the past to where those don't need to be a concern moving forward. I do wonder if it's almost easier, right, to stagger Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr., if only because, right, if the goal is to still get both of those guys anywhere in the realm of, say, 32 to 36 minutes a night, give or take, you could very easily just pick one of them to basically play the entire first quarter, and then they get their rest, and then the other one checks back in and basically plays the entire second quarter, right? So one of them plays the entire first, and then let's say KPJ is playing the entire first. Jalen could check out with, 5 to 6 minutes to go in the first quarter. So it is an early substitution, but then you get another, 5 to 6 minutes of just KPJ on the floor. And then you bring back Jalen with maybe a minute or two to go in the first quarter, or you just bring him back to start the top of the second, and he plays the entire second quarter just all the way through straight. And I think it might be easier in that regard to try and stagger those two rather than trying to mirror their minutes and then stagger Alperen Sengun outside of their minutes, if that makes sense.
It's a preference thing, but I think it's definitely possible to do either. There's another thing that I try not to do. I try not to play players in extremely long stretches. Not because that's a must, that's not one of those hard rules, but it's mostly because, I don't know, it just seemed like something was off when I had someone play the entire quarter, and it eats away. In my rotation, I have the main guys playing 30 to 32 minutes. That's what the main guys have played so far during Stephen Silas's reign as head coach. And the difference is, if you play them more, if you go into the 36-minute range, right, if you're doing that constantly every game, you're taking the minutes away from someone. And with the Rockets having so many guys that need playing time, and be it the young guys, which are those who I prioritize in this, maybe to an unrealistic extent, you're going to be, if you're running them 36 minutes a game, you're likely going to either be forced to run a 9-man rotation, or you're going to be forced into just playing someone 8 minutes a game or something like that. And then if that guy is a young guy, which it likely would be, you wouldn't be playing Eric Gordon or Jae'Sean Tate that number of minutes. Then you've gotta balance it. Is it worth it to play them 8 minutes a game versus just sending them to the G League and having them play full games? Right? It's an interesting balance to try and strike.
Absolutely. And coming up, I do want to actually take a look at some of the allocated minutes totals throughout this thought experiment that you put forward for us. We're going to take a look at that, kind of figure out which ones seem realistic, which ones seem a bit out there. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked on Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. We are free and available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. Go to YouTube, search Locked on Rockets, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Now, Paulo, looking at some of the numbers that you had jotted out here as far as divvying up playing time, I think that we'll just kind of go down the list because I think that some of these are very realistic to what is actually going to happen as far as actual playing time distribution numbers, as we kind of navigate the regular season. I think some of them are completely off base. And so we'll kind of we'll rotate through this list and see what's what. But we'll start with the four big names, right? And that's Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, Alperen Sengun. The first three names on that list, KPJ, Jalen, Jabari, you gave them 31 minutes apiece, and then Alp finished at 30 minutes as far as minutes allocation goes. I think those are pretty accurate. I think all four of those guys are going to be somewhere in that realm of anywhere from 28 to 32-ish minutes a night. And I think if you go back and look at especially the minutes tally for KPJ and Jalen Green last season, there were a lot of games where even, when the rotation was completely fleshed out, Jalen and KPJ weren't getting 36, 37 minutes a night. They weren't playing absurd, James Harden level minutes. That's just not what happens here. Not during a developmental, period with a ton of young talent on the roster. I think about 32-ish is going to be the cap for them. So I agree with all those minutes. And then even further down the list, number 5 on the list was Eric Gordon at 25 minutes a night. I firmly agree with that. I think as long as Eric Gordon is here in Houston, he's gonna get somewhere in that 25-ish range. I think it's also important to note that if you kind of extrapolate to the entire season, EG's not gonna, like, he's probably not gonna play back-to-backs. He's probably gonna miss some time here and there. I doubt he breaks 60 games, honestly, this year as a Houston Rocket. If he makes it past the trade deadline, if he plays the entire season, I doubt he goes past 60 games, which we can almost effectively bring that average even further down than if he's missing a quarter of the season to realistically, what, like 18 to 20 minutes a night instead of 25 a night? But in the actual,
do they count him like that?
Say that again?
Do they count them like that? I thought they only counted games where you actually played. But for reference,
no. I'm not saying that's how they actually like tally the minutes. I'm just saying from the thought experiment perspective of him eating into the minutes, seeing 25 minutes a night is like, oh wow, why is EG getting 25 minutes? But realistically, because he's gonna miss so much game time, more or less, you could basically think of it like EG's getting 18 minutes a night, which is a lot easier to stomach than 25. Is my point.
Yeah, I thought, and you know, considering that way of thinking it, which I think is really smart, when you look at his minutes the last two seasons, and the two seasons ago it doesn't really count because you didn't have enough young players for him not to play so much. But last season, he was playing 29 minutes a game still when he played. And so I thought going into it, when I was building the rotation, I thought 25, even 25 was a little bit low to be realistic. But then again, when you think about it from the perspective of he's going to easily miss 20 games this season, be it because a little knock, because he's, you know, they're going to be really careful with him because they likely look to deal him at the deadline anyway, so they don't want to injure him. And then any excuse will be a valid excuse for them to just, hey, Eric, just you're not feeling so well, you sit this game and we'll play someone else instead. But another thing that's really important to take into consideration with the minutes, it being 31 across the board and then Sengun 30, it's important to realize that these will vary. There will be games where they'll play 34 and there will be games where they'll play 29 because you're not, you know, calling timeouts exactly at the minute marks like the rotation is built for it to happen, right? There's going to be times where the team's on a roll and Silas is going to let them play a little bit more. There's going to be times where the team's not doing so well and Silas is going to pull guys early and he's going to try different stuff. And so it's 31 doesn't mean they'll play 31 the entire season, like exactly 31. It'll vary a little bit. I think the averages at the end of the season will even out to close to 31, 30. And Eric Gordon, I'll be happy if they give him 25. I think they'll give him more. And we'll as we get to the names further down the list, you'll realize that I was very optimistic with the minutes I'm going to give to young guys. Jae'Sean Matthews, for example, is not even on the rotation. I think that's completely unrealistic. But it's easy to, you know, I played the backup center. I played a platoon of wings there. I played Jae'Sean there. I played Jabari Smith there. And then because those guys slid down to the 5 for some minutes, that allows me to play Jae'Sean Tate and KJ Martin at the 3 and the 4 a lot because, well, I've got wings playing the 5. That allows me to play 4 wings, which is pretty unrealistic, I would say, especially because Josh Christopher and Eric Gordon are also wings, to me at least. And so realistically, you'll probably take out KJ Martin or Jae'Sean completely out of the rotation, and you'll slot Jae'Sean Matthews into basically the same allotment of minutes, I would say, just because at the end of the day, it's like I said at the beginning, you want the team to still be functional to force the development. You don't want to just throw as many young guys in there as you can and play completely dysfunctional basketball because that's not good towards development either.
Yeah, and I think that point that you just echoed, right, is the exact sentiment as to why I firmly believe EG is going to be in the starting lineup, this season, is because as great as it would be to see, what Jae'Sean could do as the starting 3, and he flashed a lot of potential, and we have sky high hopes for him down the line. It wouldn't be necessarily conducive to a good environment for Jalen and KPJ to continue developing, right? Because having EG on the floor, having a guy like that raises the floor of your team to another level, allows the opportunity for guys like Sengun, like Jalen, like KPJ to thrive when they're on the floor. So I do think it's important to kind of have that balance of, having EG out there absorbing certain minutes and having lineups that really do, accentuate and have shooters out there, have Garrison Matthews get his minutes, right? Because he does make life easier for others on the floor by spreading out the defense and stretching things out a little bit, opening up driving lanes, that kind of thing. As we go further down this list, we've gone through 5 names here, and I think you're, again, right on the money with those 5 names. First off, building a 10-man rotation, like having an actual 10-man rotation at the NBA level is just so absurd, right? Like a nightly 10-man rotation is almost unheard of, unless you're Mike Budenholzer for whatever reason. The man loves to go deep into his bench for God knows what reason. Friggin' Giannis over there getting 28 minutes a night, even though he's, in the prime of his life. But Josh Christopher at about 20 minutes a night, I could see that being a little bit lower. Especially if only because, right, we saw Josh, he was the guy that actually wound up taking the minutes hit last season when they added Dennis Schroeder to the mix. So I could see Josh being the guy that gets, anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. I think 20 minutes is definitely the upper threshold of what his minutes total will look like on a given nightly basis. And it's the next 4 names on this list where it's just all this optimism from you, and I respect it. I respect it so much. I just do not see it happening in any capacity, and that's Tari Eason with 20 minutes a night, Jae'Sean Tate at 18 minutes a night. That's the big red flag one right there. Ty Washington at 17 minutes a night, and then KJ Martin also at 17 minutes a night. I don't see a world where Jae'Sean is going to be all the way down at sub 20 minutes a night. To go from effectively a starter for 2 straight years to less than 20 minutes a night is almost impossible in my mind. And I know a big part of why his minutes took the hit in this thought experiment that you did is because you were trying not to have him and Sengun share the floor together. I do think, though, in reality, those two will have stretches where they do share the floor together. I think maybe the stretches that they do share the floor, though, those could be opportunities where we see maybe lineups that feature, Garrison Matthews out there, as well as, another couple shooter, some combination 2 out of the 3 of Garrison and Eric Gordon and Jabari, some of the premier shooters on the roster, to really kind of try to open things up more, because you're trying to offset the fact that you have 2 non-shooters out there sharing minutes at the same time.
Right, and the way the structure of the rotation is built, rather than looking at the names, it's easy to, since I'm playing effectively 6 wings, it's easy to, take a segment of the rotation away from a guy like Tari Eason and giving it to Jae'Sean Tate. I think Tari has multiple 5-minute stretches. You can take one of those away completely and you give them to Jae'Sean Tate, and all of a sudden you've got Tari or whoever you're replacing him with, be it Garrison Matthews or whoever, you've got him at 15, and then you've got Jae'Sean Tate at 23, which is a lot easier to understand, especially considering even last season compared to year 1, Jae'Sean Tate's minutes took a big drop, and it's not because he's unavailable, because he is one of the most available guys in the league, but he went down from 29 year 1 to 26 last season, and I would project him to be even lower unless he can take a jump shot. If he gets a jump shot, I think he'll get a lot more minutes, because you're looking at a guy that's going to fit into any team going forward, and if that's the case, you actually want to play that guy more minutes. But yeah, at 23. And then, since there's so many wings there, it's easy to replace Tari Eason with Usman Garuba, right? It's easy to KJ Martin, who's been rumors that he's not even with the team. It's easy to take the minutes away from KJ Martin, who I think plays exclusively the 3 and the 4. It's easy to take those minutes away from KJ and give Garrison Matthews those minutes, and the minutes that KJ currently has at the 4, you give those to Jae'Sean Tate, for example. I tried to build something that you can manipulate, and you can change the names, but it still makes sense from a the substitution patterns and from the spacing standpoint. But at the end of the day, I did give it a little bit of my own flair, in the sense that if it were up to me, I would be playing all of the young guys. I'm a big proponent of just playing almost everyone. I want to see what everyone's got, because next season is 70 million of cap space. They're going to use a lot of it. A lot of these guys, this will be their year to prove that they can achieve something at the NBA level, and to me, that should be the big priority. But then realistically, you've got to manage, and it's a legitimate concern. You've got to manage even locker room dynamics. We know Jae'Sean Tate's a big locker room leader, and you don't want to have that guy be unhappy with his minutes. You don't want to coddle him like he's James Harden, but you also don't want to, completely pull the rug from under him, right? And so, because of that, you're going to have to cater to Jae'Sean Tate, who's an important locker room guy. You're going to have to cater a little bit, I would say, even to Josh Christopher, who seems to be an important locker room guy. Eric Gordon, for sure, above everyone else. You're going to give him the minutes that he wants, right? You want those guys to be invested in helping the team, even off the court, and to have players go that extra mile. You've got to balance it out, and you've got to attend to some of the requests that they have playing time wise, because nobody wants to sit on the bench, especially guys that are not towards the near end of their careers, or even guys that like Eric Gordon, who are basically expiring contracts. There will be a little bit of Eric Gordon wanting to earn his next contract in this, right? And so you've got to balance all of those things out.
Yeah, and that's why you and I and plenty of other people who are very, very smart are not envious of the job that Stephen Silas has in front of him, trying to balance all these variables. I think removing one gigantic Christian Wood-sized variable will help a ton this year. That's going to be because that was one gigantic obstacle that was directly impeding the growth and progress for both Jalen Green and KPJ and Alperen Sengun last year. So that's going to help a ton this year. But even past that, there's still, right, and I think that's why you look through a realistic lens and you say, okay, as great as it would be to see Ty and Tari like on opening night coming off the bench, playing their roles, whatever, they don't have necessarily, like, their timelines are a little bit scaled further back from, other guys like an Eric Gordon who maybe needs to earn his next contract, right, and wants a certain amount of minutes and a certain amount of, comfort, whatever in the rotation, or a guy like KJ Martin who they may need to, maybe he doesn't have a future in Houston, but the Rockets still need to kind of showcase him a little bit and make sure that other teams are still interested in, pursuing him and actually kind of beefing up his value a little bit ahead of the trade deadline, something to that degree, right? So it's balancing all these different variables within the rotation while also still prioritizing the development and the growth of your key pieces, which are going, and I do think that, above all else, Rockets fans are going to be very upset about whatever happens with the rotation this year. Last year is evidence to that fact. Fans are going to be mad that Tari Eason isn't starting and isn't getting 20 minutes a night right out of the gate. That's going to happen almost immediately as soon as the season starts. But the important pieces of the rebuild, the pieces that definitely need to be getting their minutes and definitely need their adequate run, Jalen, KPJ, Alperen Sengun, and Jabari. Those four guys are guaranteed going to be taken care of every single night. Their minutes are not in question. They're going to get a healthy dose of minutes every single night. The guys past that, further down the roster, Josh, Usman, Ty, Tari, those guys are going to get brought along as well. They're still going to be a part of things. They're still growing, but they're not quite on the same tier of, importance as those four other names, unfortunately. And again, as far as just this thought experiment and what we expect the lineup to actually be once we hit the regular season, that very much holds true. And I think that part you can at least, take some solace in. Those four guys are going to be taken care of as far as their run goes.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing that comes up with this is not only does Garuba not get any minutes, I slotted in Ty Washington instead of Daishen Nix. If you ask me, Nix is, of course, he's going to be the one that plays. I personally am higher on Ty as a prospect and as someone who can translate to the NBA level, like as a scalable prospect, as someone who can be a starter, but he can also eventually become either the sixth man or he can become just a guard off the bench. So that's one of the other things that people brought up. And then, just so I don't forget, another distinction that I made was I tried to get one of KPJ, Jalen, or Sengun at all time on the floor. I didn't count Jabari in this because I think Jabari year one is not going to be asked to be a shot creator much or someone who runs the offense. And I do think that KPJ, Jalen, and Sengun are like clear-cut the guys that are going to be generating offense for themselves and for others during the season. And so those were the three I prioritized, having at least one of them on the floor. Doesn't mean Ty and Josh can't run the offense from time to time. Just because someone's on the floor, just because it's the Sengun unit, doesn't mean that every single possession is a Sengun possession. But, you want to have one of your top tier shot creators there at all times, because once again, you want some type of some amount of you want it to work out.
You want some offensive consistency on the floor.
Yeah.
And those guys, the other guys that you named, right? Those guys can be secondary creators with a primary creator on the floor. What you don't want to have happen is you're missing one of your primary creators, and then a guy who is more accustomed, more equipped to be a secondary creator is forced into that primary creator role, and that's when you get into train wreck looking offense. Like if Josh Christopher becomes your number one option offensively and he's the one who's tasked with creating for everybody else on the floor, situationally he can do it, but doing it over the course of a whole 5 to 6 minute stretch, you're going to get some ugly offensive possessions.
As happened in the G League, as happened in the Summer League. So if it happened in Summer League, imagine how it would happen in the NBA against much better players.
Yeah, so we'll see how that plans out, or how that all pans out. I will put a link to Paulo's article in the episode description, as well as a link to the website where you can go fiddle with the lineups and stuff yourself. It's a ton of fun to play around with. I'm gonna eventually try and mock up what I think is actually going to be the Rockets rotation. If I was a better podcast host, I would have done that before we started recording, and I wish I had that thought before hitting the record button instead of halfway through the episode where it's like, oh, I should have done this. That would have been for a cool whatever. I'll put it out there on Twitter. I'll do my own little mock-up of it, and you can compare Paulo's and mine, and it'll be a ton of fun. Paulo, let everybody know where to track you down at.
Yeah, y'all can find me on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. It's the off-season. There's a bunch of questions of where my content will be, but if you liked what you heard from me, everything will be linked on there at some point in the next 2 weeks.
That's going to do it for our show today. As always, thank you so much for checking out the episode. Thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, Odyssey app, free and available on all podcast platforms. We're also on YouTube, so go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.